This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and welcome to another MTG Top 10. A couple of months back, we looked at Torment, a set that was intentionally unbalanced to favor black over all other colors, and green and white were especially minimized. Today, we're looking at the set that came immediately after, Judgment, and it was unbalanced in the opposite direction, with green and white the focus of this set. This is the most simply conveyed by the set's card breakdown by color. 66 of the 143 cards in this set are green or white, 54 are red or blue, and only 16 are black. And there are also 3 non-basic lands and 4 multicolored cards, all of them green-white. When we looked at Torment, we definitely saw that the best cards in the set were black. So I thought it would be interesting to see if Judgment's unbalanced nature was also reflected by the cards that have been the most successful and Magic's highest level of competition. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its original printing in Judgment. In all, 141 cards were eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get to today's list though, let me tell you about this video's special sponsor, Into the AM. They're an amazing apparel company that has periodically sponsored my content over the years, and I'm always really excited to share their great products with you. This year they've launched a lot of new apparel, especially when it comes to warm weather clothing, something we all need this time of year. In addition to their great graphic tees, they also are now carrying jackets, sweaters, and hoodies, like the one I'm wearing now, which is their pullover hoodie in maroon. It's super comfortable and is definitely doing a great job of keeping me warm, and it also comes in lots of other great colors. If you're interested in purchasing some of their offerings, now is a great time to do it because they have an extended Black Friday and Cyber Monday sale that is ongoing from now until December 5th. And it's the biggest sale of the year. You can get 60% off site-wide, and if you use my link in the description below, you get an additional 10% off. It's a great time to get holiday gifts for others, or get something special for yourself. Alright, let's get back to the video. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Quiet Speculation. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a sorcery that lets you search a player's library for up to 3 cards with Flashback and put them into that player's graveyard. Flashback made its debut in Odyssey Block, and it was a very heavily featured mechanic in all 3 sets, so this had plenty of stuff to search up, even back then. Typically, you'll be searching your own library with this, and when you're playing it in a Flashback heavy deck, it's going to be super good. It basically becomes a 2-mana Ancestral Recall when you've got the right cards to get. Speculation was so good that it spawned an entire deck built around it in Block, and it was heavily featured in Standard too, usually in blue-green aggro decks that ran Roar of the Worm. Searching up 3 of those with Speculation usually meant your opponent was going to be in a world of hurt in the future. However, Quiet Speculation hasn't put up any top 8 since rotating out of Standard, way back in 2003. At number 9, it's Prismatic Strands. For 2 generic and a white, it's an instant that prevents all damage that sources of the color of your choice would deal this turn, and it has Flashback, tap an untapped white creature you control. So with this one card, you can prevent all damage from a single color for 2 turns, and you only have to pay mana for it the first time. You can even just get it into your graveyard and never pay mana for it too. This saw a bit of play in Block and Extended back in the day, but most of its success has come in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. It sees play in all sorts of white decks in the format, and it's largely a main deck card. Burn decks are one of the best decks in the format, and this kind of prevention is always great against that type of deck, but there are lots of other cards in the format that are all about doing a lot of damage too, like Crypt Rats or any heavily enchanted creature in Aura decks, and this can really stop those types of decks from doing what they want to. On top of all of that, Monarch decks are also a huge factor in the format. When you're the Monarch, you get to draw extra cards, but your opponent can take your Monarch status away by doing combat damage to you. Using Prismatic Strands to hold on to your Monarch status is very powerful. This is especially true when you use a white creature like Palace Sentinels to become the Monarch in the first place. It's going to keep seeing play in Pauper, and it could move up this list as some of the cards in front of it are inactive. At number 8, it's Genesis. For 4 generic and a green, it's a 4/4, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard, you can pay 2 generic and a green, and if you do, you return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. One of many cards with the Incarnation type in this set, All of them are creatures who have some kind of effect when they're in the graveyard, and this one's pretty powerful since it gives you the ability to recur a card from your graveyard every single turn. So if you're in a grindy graveyard deck, Genesis is just what you want. And indeed, those are the exact kind of decks that was played in between 2002 and 2008. It did the most work in Extended, where it was often played in Gifts Ungiven decks. If you search up two cards with gifts, they always both go in the graveyard, and these decks often won the game by searching up Genesis and some other creature you really wanted, and if you did that, you'd always get it on your turn. A common target was Ravenous Baloth, which was very easy to stabilize with alongside gifts since it could just gain you life every turn. All that said, Genesis hasn't put up any top 8s in more than 15 years. At number 7, it's Mental Note. For 1 blue mana, it's an instant that mills 2 cards, and then you draw a card. This is a really great card draw spell, especially because most blue decks are pretty interested in getting cards in the graveyard too, so this often delivers way more than 1 mana and 1 card worth of value. For example, if you played it in your extended Psychotog deck like many people did in the mid-2000s, you have a single card putting 3 cards into the graveyard and 1 into your hand, getting you a lot closer to doing lethal with the Tog. It was also useful in Legacy Threshold decks, which ran cards like Tarmogoyf and Nimble Mongoose, both of which got better the more cards you put into the graveyard. Today, the only 60-card format it sees play in is Pauper, where it's played in Dimir control decks, which look to win the game with Gurmag Angler and Tolarian Terror, both of which greatly benefit from putting extra cards into your graveyard. It's likely to keep seeing play in Pauper going forward. At number 6, I've got 2 cards. Wonder, which is the legitimate number 6, and Anger, which would have been at number 9 if I gave it its own slot. I put them together because they are similar cards that are part of the same uncommon cycle of incarnations, all of which are 4 mana creatures that have a keyword ability, and if they end up in your graveyard, they grant that keyword ability to all of your creatures, provided you control a basic land that produces mana of their color. In the case of Anger, it's 3 generic and a red for a 2/2 with haste, and Wonder is a 4 mana 2/2 with flying. Funnily enough, the green and white cards from this cycle, Brawn and Valor, aren't on the list despite the green-white focus of the set. Anyway, let's talk about Anger first. It's most frequently been used over the years in combo decks that look to load their graveyard and win in a single attack. For example, in Extended, Anger was used in Angry Ghoul decks, which would mill the whole library and fill the graveyard with lots of big creatures, plus Sutured Ghoul and Anger, so you could reanimate the Ghoul, exile all those creatures in the graveyard apart from Anger, and easily swing for lethal with Sutured Ghoul in a single turn. It's also been featured in Legacy Dredge decks, which like to give Hogak and friends haste, ending the game even more quickly than an early game Hogak usually can. Anger is going to continue to enable decks that like to put creatures into play from the graveyard in Legacy. Wonder, meanwhile, found a lot more success in Standard than Anger ever did, largely because Blue-Green Madness is one of the best decks in the format. The deck was built around using free discard outlets like Wild Mongrel to discard Madness cards and cast them at a discount, or even for free. This also meant you could easily get Wonder into the graveyard and give your whole board flying. It was also played in extended Psychotog decks, which could usually win the game in a single swing from Psychotog, and Wonder could make sure Psychotog got in for lethal in the air. It was also played in Legacy Survival of the Fittest, where it could be discarded to Survival while you search up some other creature. You could of course easily find Wonder when you needed it in that deck too, but ultimately Survival of the Fittest got banned in Legacy. However, while Wonder has the more impressive resume so far, Anger is more active right now. This is true even with the fact that Wonder got a modern legal reprint when Anger didn't, partly because Wonder hasn't taken that much advantage of the reprint, only seeing a bit of play in Dredge decks. Both of them are likely to continue to put up top 8s though. The keywords they grant are very powerful when you can effectively get them for your whole board for free. At number 5, it's Crows and Reclamation. For 1 generic and a green, it's an instant that shuffles 2 cards from target player's graveyard into their library. It also comes with flashback for 1 generic and a green. It was heavily played in Standard and Extended between 2002 and 2005. You've probably already gathered that Odyssey block as a whole was a graveyard-focused block, and many decks in the format were reliant on graveyard strategies, either using cards with flashback, trying to get Threshold going, or using cards like Anger or Wonder that granted keywords from the graveyard, as well as the usual reanimation strategies and the like. Reclamation being an instant speed way to deal with all of those powerful graveyard strategies was great, but it hasn't put up any top 8 since 2005. At number 4, it's Sylvan Safekeeper. For 1 green mana, it's a 1/1, and you sacrifice a land to give a creature you control Shroud until end of turn. Fun fact, this was an invitational card. If you don't know what that is, between 1996 and 2007, Magic's top players got invited to an invitational tournament, and whoever won got to help design a card with their likeness. This card was designed by the winner of the very first invitational, Ollie Rod. Anyway, obviously enough, the Safekeeper is pretty sweet because it can protect creatures from being targeted for no mana at all. Giving up a land is a cost, but having access to Shroud even when you're tapped out is pretty great. For a long time though, the Safekeeper didn't see much play apart from a few extended top 8s, but starting in 2011, it began to see play in toolbox decks in Legacy. These are decks that run lots of disruptive creatures that are often really great in the right situation, and these decks use Green Sun Zenith or Court of Calling to search up those ideal cards. And the Safekeeper was one you could grab when you needed to protect a creature. In addition to seeing main deck play in that kind of deck, it was also played in the sideboard of Dark Depths decks, which looked to cheat a 2020 into play in the extreme early game. The Safekeeper is sided in against opponents who have lots of interaction to make that less of an issue. The Safekeeper has also enjoyed a significant renaissance this year as a result of the release of Modern Horizons 3. Not only did it get printed in the set, making it legal in Modern for the first time, the set also featured the incredibly broken Nadu Winged Wisdom, which spawned decks in both Modern and Legacy that were all about making tokens and constantly targeting your creatures multiple times in a turn to get Nadu's trigger. And the Safekeeper is not only a good way to protect Nadu, but a good way to get Nadu's trigger for no mana. Nadu got banned in Modern as a result of how powerful this was, although the Safekeeper and Nadu are still doing their thing in Legacy right now, so it's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 3, it's Ray of Revelation. For one generic and a white, it's an instant that destroys an enchantment, and you can flash it back for a single green mana. This is a sweet way to blow up enchantments since you get to do it twice with one card if you're in green-white. Or if you put it in your graveyard, you can just look at it as a super cheap way to destroy a single enchantment. It's been played in multiple formats over the years, usually showing up in the sideboards of graveyard decks when there are particularly problematic enchantments in a format. It also benefited from a reprint in Dark Ascension, which gave it an extended period of time in Standard, and is still seeing some play in Legacy and Modern today. At number 2, I once again have two cards because they're from the same cycle. Those cards are Burning Wish, which would have been at number 4, and Cunning Wish, which is the legitimate number 2. Like we saw with the Uncommon Incarnation cycle, it's kind of funny that the red and blue cards from this cycle made the list, and not the green and white ones. These were part of a cycle of wishes, all of which let you grab a card from outside the game and put it into your hand. It should be noted, in competitive Magic, that means you get a card from your sideboard. Burning Wish is a sorcery for one generic and a red that lets you grab a sorcery, and Cunning Wish is an instant that costs 2 generic and a blue that lets you grab an instant. While these cards weren't the first time we had a card that could do this sort of thing, that was Ring of Maruf. But before Judgment's Wish cycle, that was just a really weird one-of card, while the Wish cycle solidified this as a mechanic, and it's an effect that we see a lot ever since then. And it's also super powerful when it's flexible enough and cheap enough, and Burning Wish and Cunning Wish are perfect examples of that. Wishes are much like tutors, only you can only search your sideboard, of course, but this can still make your deck way more consistent the way a tutor can. Burning Wish saw some play in Standard, where it was a useful card in spell-heavy Psychotog decks. However, Burning Wish really caught on in Extended Legacy and Vintage Storm decks. Storm decks generally like to cast as many spells as they can in a turn, and then cast something like Tendrils of Agony to win on the spot. Burning Wish could grab you your Tendrils, and this was advantageous because you didn't really want to draw Tendrils until your Storm count was high enough for you to win with it. In fact, it made those decks so consistent that it was restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy for several years, and these days it's still being played in Storm decks in the Eternal formats. Cunning Wish has been more successful overall and played in a wider variety of decks. This is because it can grab an instant, and it's an instant itself, which often means you can grab something you can cast right away, allowing you to do something interactive. You can get counter magic like Force of Will, hate cards like Surgical Extraction, or combo pieces like High Tide, and it's been doing all of those things in Legacy for quite a while, while also seeing a bit of play in Vintage on occasion. Both Burning Wish and Cunning Wish continue to be active in the Eternal formats, and it's not entirely possible that Cunning Wish especially one day catches the number 1 card on the list. However, for now, that card is Cabal Therapy. That's right, the number 1 card on the Judgment list is black. That seems like a pretty big failure for a set that was supposed to be all about green and white and minimize black, but I guess at the same time it is the only black card on the list. Cabal Therapy is one of Magic's best discard spells. For 1 black mana, it's a sorcery, and you name a non-land card, then your opponent reveals his or her hand and discards all cards with that name. You can also flash it back by sacrificing a creature. Having to name the right card can be tricky on your first try, but the flashback makes sure you hit at least one card in most cases, and if you're well versed about decks in your metagame, you might even hit something the first time. This spell is super cheap, highly disruptive, and very easy to flash back. In fact, in most decks that run Therapy, sacrificing a creature is either trivial or can generate some upside. One of the nastiest decks it was ever part of was the extended Icarid deck, which looked to dump a massive chunk of the deck into the graveyard and bring back multiple Icarids every turn. An Icarid gets sacrificed at the end of your turn anyway, so casting your Cabal Therapies from the same graveyard your Icarids came from was pure value, and usually allowed you to completely disarm your opponent so the Icarids could finish the job. It's continued to see play in similar decks in Legacy and Vintage, and while Icarid isn't always in those decks, there are plenty of similar creatures, like Narcomoeba who comes into play for free when it gets milled, and many of those decks also run Bridge from Below and can give you a zombie token when you sacrifice a creature to flashback Therapy. So yeah, Cabal Therapy is the most impactful card in all of Judgment, despite being black, and I think it'll stay at the top of this list for the foreseeable future. Overall, I think we've seen that the set's emphasis on green and white did not necessarily result in the set having lots of good green-white cards. Only half of the list is green or white, after all. So those are the top 10 cards in Judgment. If you want to own any of these powerful cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at specific sets, like the MTG Top 10 on Torment, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.